Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's HoUSed campaign call. We are going to give it just a minute for folks to log on. Apologies for the delay in getting started, and thank you for joining. Hi, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are giving it just a minute for folks to log on. Apologies for the delay in getting started, but appreciate you being here. All right, it looks like things have started to slow down. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's HoUSed campaign call for the long-term solutions needed to end the nation's affordable housing and homelessness crises. So for just a little bit of background, July has been a busy month in housing policy. The House released their draft budget for HUD programs in FY24 last week, and we are expecting the Senate to share their draft bills today. We are going to get into the details of the bill during our policy update towards the end of the call. But before that, we're going to be hearing about some exciting new information from some of our state and national partners. We're going to hear about the administration's All Inside initiative to address unsheltered homelessness. We'll share new research from Eviction Lab on the connection between the cost of eviction filing fees and eviction rates. We're going to get a reminder about FHFA's request for information on tenant protections. We'll hear updates from the field and much more. So without further ado, let's jump in and get started. People are introducing themselves in the chat. Love that. Love to see it. Thank you again for joining. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Chad Maisel. Chad is the Special Assistant to the President for Housing and Urban Policy at the White House Domestic Policy Council, and he joins us today to talk about the administration's All Inside initiative to address unsheltered homelessness. Chad, thank you so much for joining and welcome.
Sure, thanks, Kim. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you great.
Excellent. Okay, I had kind of a frantic 8 minutes leading up to this as I tried to sort out my technology. So thanks for having me, and just really thrilled to be here with this great group and excited to stick around the call too, because it sounds like a great agenda. So as Kim noted, my name is Chad Maisel. I'm here at the White House Domestic Policy Council, where I lead our housing and urban policy portfolio. I've been here since pretty much the start of the administration, covering a range of issues focused primarily around wealth building and the racial wealth gap. But I'm especially excited to be here today to talk about an initiative that we launched back in May, All Inside, really a first of its kind effort and initiative to address unsheltered homelessness across the country. So listen, President Biden believes that everyone deserves a safe, decent, and affordable place to live. And he's really charged us, the staff, to concrete action to show that and make that real. As you all know very well, our nation's homelessness challenge is fundamentally a housing one. It's why we in the administration have put so much focus over the course of the last 2+ years on boosting housing supply. Many of you are familiar with the administration's Housing Supply Action Plan, which lays out a series of concrete actions to ease the burden of housing costs over time, and primarily by boosting the supply of quality housing. You are also familiar with the White House blueprint for a renter's bill of rights, which sets out common sense principles to really establish a shared baseline for fairness for renters in the rental housing market. So what I will say is, in the next couple of weeks, we hope to have some news on both fronts. So stay tuned and look forward to engaging with you all. Now, on All Inside. So back in December, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness released All In, which is the administration's federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. It lays out a series of strategies and sets an ambitious goal of cutting homelessness by 25% by the year 2025. plan emphasizes the importance of pursuing policies that we know work, like Housing First. The plan also focuses on homelessness prevention. We know that, we not only need to help people who are homeless become housed, but also prevent people from falling into homelessness to begin with. And that's as important as anything, of course. We know we can do it. It's what we accomplished during the pandemic. With the American Rescue Plan, we deployed over 11 million emergency rental assistance payments, pursued mortgage forbearance policies, both of which kept millions of Americans in their homes. It's why homelessness remained flat from 20 to 22, despite truly unprecedented economic headwinds. Now, today in 2023, we know we continue to face many of these same structural challenges with the housing market. We also know that, despite the fact that, homelessness stayed relatively flat between 2020 and 2022, we've seen an uptick in unsheltered homelessness, and accounts for about 40% of all people experiencing homelessness as of the last pit count. These are folks who are living in tents and transit stations and other unsheltered settings. So back in May, the White House, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and member agencies announced All Inside. As I said, this is a new initiative where the administration is partnering directly with state and local governments to strengthen and accelerate their own efforts to get unsheltered folks into homes. We're working for now with 6 places. Those 6 places are Chicago, Dallas, LA, Phoenix metro area, Seattle, and the state of California. And really what we're doing, this is a place-based initiative. We are working with these places on their own locally identified priorities, their locally identified needs, and we are doing what we can to accelerate them and help move progress forward. We in the administration, we're providing a number of supports for these places, the centerpiece of which is a full-time senior official who is dedicated to that place, really embedded in that community, in that place, to help them accelerate their own priorities and really navigate the federal government, break down barriers, break down red tape, and equally important is really surface policy challenges that need to be addressed at the federal level, whether that's on prevention, whether that's on benefits alignment and integration, whether that's on best practices around data collection, data sharing, and so on. So really what we're hoping to do in this initiative is we are accelerating these locally driven priorities with a full-time staff and an entire dedicated teams at the federal level to help, again, navigate those processes. And also, we're hoping that in the process, we're surfacing broader challenges, broader policy initiatives that we can take on that can be applied, not just in those 6 places, but across the country. So, listen, in terms of where we are, we've got our team lead in place in 5 of the 6 communities. We hope very, very soon we'll have our 6th and final federal team lead in place, at which point we're going to get to work developing work plans and identifying the set of concrete actions that we're going to take on together. We know that these are incredibly complicated issues that we're dealing with in these places. We also know that no community is quite alike. No 2 communities are quite alike. And so I'm thrilled to be talking with you all because I'm hoping that this can be an ongoing conversation. You are advocates, experts, local leaders, funders, have just so much expertise that we really hope will inform this effort and are going to be critical to any progress that we make. So, consider this an opening offer in hopes that we can continue to work together in the days, weeks, and months to come to address this really complex but absolutely critical challenge. With that, I'll glad to pause and take questions. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chad. That was a great overview. We do have some questions coming in. It looks like a lot of people are really interested in this and interested in learning about how to get their communities involved. and how their communities might be chosen to participate.
I'm sorry, Kim, it was a little choppy there. Would you mind saying it one more time?
Yeah, of course. We're getting some questions from folks who are really interested in figuring out how their communities could also be participants in this initiative.
Oh, sure. Like places that were not necessarily included in the story. Yeah. So great question. And what I'll say is this, we are currently working in these 6 places, and we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to drive progress in those 6 places. That said, we recognize that so many communities across the country are struggling with this and doing really innovative work as well to address this challenge. And we want to make sure that we're both learning from and supporting those places. So HUD recently, released about $486 million to help communities address unsheltered and rural homelessness. They're launching a technical assistance effort to similarly accelerate local efforts. And so while we're doing this kind of focused effort with team leads in these 6 places, we're hoping that we can, expand our reach, much more broadly. So what I'll say is this, Kim, I hope there's an opportunity to kind of share my information. We have an entire team, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, the Domestic Policy Council, my boss director, Neera Tandon, of the DPC. This is just absolutely one of our top priorities across the board, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help folks, address this challenge.
Great, thank you, Chad. Another question. How did the administration seek input from service providers and people with lived experience in developing this initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this initiative was really born out of All In, the federal strategic plan that I mentioned, and that process was a many months long effort led by the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness and member agencies. And it benefited from input from really across the board, including, experts and academics, researchers, and most importantly, folks who have actually, have lived experience with homelessness. So we came to this particular intervention based on what we've heard communities need and what the biggest challenges they face. And, in addition to funding, of course, which, sadly, we are doing what we can, it's also about how can these communities work better with the federal government? How can the federal government, better support local efforts? And so what the intervention that we've designed here with a full-time person with expertise in this space who can help, and who is not only embedded in the community, but has access to a suite of people, desk officers of sorts across federal agencies to help them navigate those issues that are identified. We think that is as important as anything in terms of, helping communities address the particular issues that they're facing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chad. And a question about how HUD could help, HUD and local localities could help the administration really expand the reach of this program. Is there anything that localities or HUD could be doing to help, expand awareness or get more localities involved?
Yeah, so HUD, recently announced the special NOFO, again, focused on a Notice of Funding Opportunity, the $486 million focus on unsheltered homelessness. And we see that as just really like an incredible commitment to this particular issue and helping communities address it. And so, and I think the challenge for us, and again, I'd love to engage with the folks who are asking the questions and others on the call. The challenge for us over the next several months is making sure that whatever we do with these 6 places in particular, with LA, with Chicago, with Dallas, with Chicago, with Seattle, that we are taking those learnings, taking those challenges, and applying it much more broadly. I don't think this is a success if we're only driving progress in the 6 places. We want to make sure that we're hearing from other places, and importantly, we're taking the learnings and the policy actions that we're helping these 6 communities navigate and applying it more broadly. So that's really the charge of the next 6, 12, 18 months, to make sure that really everyone is benefiting from it and we're able to drive progress nationally and across the board.
Fantastic. So one more question and then we'll let you go. Well, two technically. So the first, is there any movement around, implementing some sort of a homeless bill of rights, much like the Tenants' Bill of Rights the administration published? Or there's a question here about the possibility of President Biden declaring a national emergency on homelessness. So just wanted to get your thoughts on those kind of big picture ideas around addressing homelessness from the administrative side.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so we are laser focused on implementing the plans that we have put forward. And we think the blueprint for a Renters' Bill of Rights is absolutely critical and a foundational document. And if done right, would be really transformational in terms of preventing homelessness and supporting affordability for renters across the country. Similarly, our work on housing supply, like this just has to be, item, at the top of all of our lists, along with the work on tenant protections to, when it comes to addressing homelessness, how do we boost supply? And so really we're focused on implementing those, accelerating those, increasing the ambition around those things. At the same time, we're going to continue to look for concrete opportunities to with Congress and otherwise, to increase the amount of resources that we're able to bring to bear to address homelessness across the country. I think that priority is reflected in the president's budget proposal and will continue to be. And what I can say is we're going to continue to look at all available levers, using those authorities creatively so that we can make a dent and more in these on these critical issues.
Great, thank you, Chad. And so our last question.
Sure.
There are certainly a number of people who on this call who I think would be thrilled for the opportunity to weigh in with you and to continue this conversation. So what's the best way for folks to get in contact with you or your office?
Yeah, sure. So why don't I'm just trying to think of what's the easiest. I'm happy to share my, Kim, if you want to share contact information for anyone who asks, or whatever makes sense. We have a small but mighty team here focused on housing policy at the White House, and certainly want to hear from you. So glad to share my contact information.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chad. We have a in the chat. If you're able to stay on, you'd be welcome to help answer those, but if not, also totally understand. Really appreciate you taking on this issue.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. And I unfortunately, we do not have the ability to view the chat function on Zoom calls here on the White House Zoom platform. So I can't see those, but I'll just kind of assume they're all compliments and
definitely. I mean,
but thanks and excited to be in touch with you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chad. And thank you again for joining. We will have to have you back on as the initiative moves forward to hear updates.
Deal. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chad. And I see in the chat, I'm having some trouble with my audio. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and then I'm going to work on that. Apologies, I have no idea why my audio is always choppy. I literally got a new computer because it was an issue on my old one and it did not fix it. So we're going to figure it out. But anyway, in the meantime, it is my pleasure to introduce Henry Gormley, who is a research assistant at Eviction Lab. Henry and his colleagues recently published new research looking at the connection between the cost for filing for an eviction and the rate of eviction filings. Henry, thank you so much for joining.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name's Henry. I'm a graduate student in sociology at Princeton University and a research assistant at the Eviction Lab. And so I was just looking to do a screen share if that's possible. Okay, great. Okay, so if everyone can see my screen now, I'm going to be presenting the results of a study on the effects of filing fees. This is a study that was published in Housing Policy and Debate a few months ago. And so just to begin with, this is probably a review for everyone on this call, but I'll just give a little bit of background on existing sociological research on policies that affect eviction practices. So there's been considerable research on economic interventions. Unsurprisingly, they find that if we reduce housing costs or increase tenants' incomes, it reduces eviction filings against them. So these studies have looked at housing subsidies like Section 8 public housing and others, finding that particularly the ones that offer very deep subsidies, such as public housing, reduce eviction rates to a greater degree. They've also looked at some of the expansions in sort of aid, in financial aid through the COVID-19 policies, including unemployment insurance and stimulus payments. And studies have also looked at Medicaid expansion and found that increasing the expansion of Medicaid reduced eviction filings. This study that I'm going to be talking about fits more into the regulatory interventions. These are ones that look at policies specifically affecting the eviction process. So these, well, the larger policy environment as well. So these include studies looking at the broader rental market regulations, things like the degree to which the warranty of habitability is enforced, and there's right of refusal for tenants and things like that. And then there are a number of studies looking at courtroom dynamics, so showing that legal representation during the eviction process, requiring landlords to give notices before summons, both improve tenant outcomes during the eviction process and reduce eviction filings respectively. But this study is looking at filing fees. So what is a filing fee? If we think about the eviction process, going from landlord serving a notice to a tenant, to filing in court, to having a hearing, to a court decision, and eventually, in some cases, enforcement, the tenant being removed, the filing fee is the beginning of the legal court-oriented eviction process. And just a quick background, again, probably review, something everybody here knows, but evictions are used for a variety of purposes. We often think about evictions being used as sort of a last resort when landlords want to remove a tenant that they've tried to work with, but it's often not the case. Often it's often a first resort when tenants are behind on rent, say at the first of the month. And sort of this first resort versus last resort dichotomy of landlord eviction practices often maps onto large versus small landlords, where small landlords are probably more likely often to work with tenants until their last resort is evicting, versus the large scale are more often sort of file on that fifth of the month. Anyone who's behind on rent is going to get an eviction filing. And so this sort of like frequent frequent eviction filing is often called serial filing, because what ends up happening is, a tenant will be filed against, they'll eventually pay back the back rent they owe, and they'll subsequently be filed against in the future. And so it shows the way these filings are often used not to remove tenants, but as a method of rent collection, and as a method of changing the landlord-tenant relationship. So once a landlord has brought a tenant to court and gotten a judgment against them, even if it doesn't require the tenant to leave the property, once they have a court decision saying the tenant owes back rent, it gives the landlord a number of legal advantages and changes the relationship from one of two transactors in a relationship to a creditor and debtor, and kind of provides a more expedited path to eviction in the future. So even in these cases where serial filings are used frequently and the tenant's not removed from the property, they're really important because they change the relationship, but they also mark the tenants with an eviction record, and also can end up having court fees passed on to the tenants. So given that background, I'll just move on to the actual study itself. So we collected data on the amount it costs to file to begin an eviction case at the county level throughout the United States. This data was collected in the summer of 2018. And we collected basically the cost to file, lowest cost to file, not including execution. And so we also validated the data by having cross-validation between people who are collecting the data. And we collected it by, looking at county level websites and then calling county level administrators where necessary, emailing, but often where possible using online resources. And so what we found, it was kind of surprising, for anyone who's done spatial research, everything is correlated. Tends to be that multiple social characteristics tend to all be sort of concentrated in space. And it was surprising basically how arbitrary we found these filing fees to be. So if we look at this map, what this shows is at the county level, the filing fee, where darker red areas have higher filing fees and lighter red areas have lower filing fees. And there's no, for example, regional pattern. It's not like the Northeast has high filing fees and the South has low fees, or we also found we looked at political party, basically using the presidential vote share in 2016 and 2020. And there's very little pattern there either. We looked at different housing market regulations, the racial demographics, the socioeconomic status. We looked at whether cities had higher filing fees compared to rural areas. And we found it was just highly varied and almost arbitrary which areas had high fees and which areas had low fees. And that was quite surprising for us. And so we kind of tried to figure out what's going on there. And what we found is that often, the eviction filing fee has the same determinants as any other civil court case. So in Minnesota, it costs the exact same amount to file for an eviction as it does to file for divorce or to file to adopt a child, file for small claims. And even in areas where it wasn't the exact same, it tended not to be the exact same, but even in those areas, a lot of the determinants were the same. And so it wasn't something that, these fees weren't being decided as something that was a direct and considered response to the eviction characteristics in the area or the eviction dynamics. And a lot of times these determinants of civil court cases were highly sort of arbitrary and almost random. And so you'd see things like additional costs being levied in order to provide a roadside memorial, to digitize library records, to provide a coat room in the court. And we looked at some reports that talked about the determinants of these fees, and they said, in Illinois, at least, this is a Byzantine system, a complex web of filing fees, fines, surcharges, and other costs, wildly inconsistent from county to county. And that was echoed in other reports that we saw. And the sort of the arbitrariness of these fees is really important. The reason I'm spending so much time on it is just because it has important implications, first for the analysis. In order to see the effects of filing fees, we want to be able to compare similar areas, but also for policy. If we find that these fees are highly arbitrary, it makes it less of a difficult decision of whether to change them, basically. Oh, sorry about that. So, oops, I didn't mean to go back, but now, okay. So then moving on to the methodology of the paper, we looked at the census tract level. So census tract was about 4,000 people. And we looked at the ones that had valid eviction data, which was about 50% of the United States. We wanted to have high quality eviction data. And we looked at three outcomes. So the first one is the filing rate, which is the number of eviction filings per renter household. So a rate of 10% means if there were 100 renter households, there were 10 eviction filings in that year. Then there's the judgment rate, which is the number of evictions that not only were filed, but reached a court-ordered judgment. That's not necessarily an indication that the tenants were removed from the property, but it's there's a greater chance in those cases. So we usually think of filing rates and judgment rates as the beginning of the process and a stronger indicator that the tenant was actually kicked out. And then we looked at serial filing rates, and we defined those as the percent of all filings within a tract in which the filing was made against someone that had been filed against previously in that year. And so if you see a serial filing rate of 10%, that means 1 out of every 10 filing was against someone who had previously been filed against. And these are important because they're an indicator of landlords using eviction very readily. And so then we looked at the effects of filing fees on these three outcomes after controlling for a wide range of tract level characteristics. And we looked separately for the full sample and then for race-based subsamples. So we looked, what is the effect size in majority white areas? What is the effect size in majority Black areas, in majority Hispanic areas? And then we also looked at what is the effect size in high poverty areas, because we wanted to basically see, is there a racially disparate effect of differences in filing fees? So moving on to the first set of results, what this shows on the right, this plot shows the x-axis is the sample that was that the estimate pertains to. So the first is the full sample. Then we have majority white, majority Black, majority Hispanic, high poverty. And the y-axis shows the estimated change in eviction filing rate from a $76 increase in filing fees. The reason we looked at $76 is because this is one standard deviation. But the fees basically ranged from about $50 to about $300, $350. And so 76 is a fairly substantial, but it's not as if the full range is you know, from 50 to 125. And so what we see here is in the full sample, if we raise filing fees by $76, we'd expect filing rates to decrease by 1.7 percentage points. But if we look in majority Black areas, we see that the decrease would be 4.8 percentage points, and it would be only 1.2 in majority white areas. So what this is showing is that not only is there a substantially large decrease in filing fees overall from increasing, decrease in filing rates from increasing filing fees, but it's just dramatically larger in majority Black areas. And another point just is, although 1.7 percentage points may seem relatively small, it's important to keep in mind that across all areas in our sample, the median filing rate was only 3.3 percentage points. So this represents a substantial decrease in filing rates, but one that is dramatically larger in majority Black areas. So moving on to the judgment rate. And so remember, this is the rate that, you know, tends to signal tenants being removed from the property more often. The effect size across the full sample is about a 0.5 percentage point decrease in judgment rate, but in majority Black areas, the decrease is 1.4 percentage points, and compared to 0.3 percentage points in majority white areas. And so what we're seeing is, again, a dramatically racially disparate effect of filing fees. And then moving on finally to the serial rate. So again, this is sort of how readily landlords use eviction filings. This is, you know, the percent of the filings that are filed against households that have been filed against in the past. We see raising filing fees decreases serial rates by 3.1 percentage points in the full sample, and decreases by about 5.3 percentage points in the majority Black sample. And so what this is showing, the effect on the serial rates suggests that the increase in filing rates has its biggest effect on these landlords who are using eviction very readily and very often against the same households. And as a final point, you know, we used the high poverty neighborhoods as sort of a way to look at, is it the racially disparate effect in majority Black areas? Is this huge effect we see there, is that about the race of the residents there, or is it about other socioeconomic factors? And so we wanted to look at whether, compared to high poverty areas, do majority Black areas have higher effect sizes, and we found that they did. And we also did some supplemental analyses to basically show this isn't a result of majority Black areas having higher poverty rates or lower household incomes. It seems to be a direct result of the racial composition. So just kind of summarizing and moving on to discussion, why do filing fees have such a large effect? You know, we might think $75, what does that really matter? You might think, you know, often these tenants are behind on huge amounts of rent. Why would $75 matter? And so I think the first point, I'll go to the second bullet point, is that often actually the amount of back rent is very low. We found, I hope I can get the numbers exactly right, but it was maybe 1 in 8 or 1 in 7 or something of filings are for less than $500. And just overall, there are many instances where landlords are filing over relatively small amounts of money. But I think the most important point is simply the way and the reasons in which landlords are using eviction filings. So, you know, if this is a case where a landlord is using eviction as a last resort and they've worked with their tenant for months and months trying to get them to pay the back rent or figure out a way to get both parties happy, and then they're eventually filing, odds are $76 isn't going to matter that much. But if this is a landlord who owns hundreds of units, particularly in a low income area where tenants are often behind on rent, and they're filing on the 5th of the month, the 10th of the month against everybody who's late on rent. So they're filing against, you know, tens or even, dozens of households each month. You know, $76 increase is going to be very important. It could really affect their bottom line. And I think as a final point, there's a huge degree of ambiguity, especially for small scale landlords, in deciding when to evict. I think, you know, it's hard to calculate the cost of renovating a property, finding a new tenant, missed rent, against the cost of future missed rent. It's just a difficult decision. And so I think sometimes that upfront cost of a filing fee can have a big effect. And so as a final point, why do filing fees have a racially disparate effect? And I think it's a simple answer of the effect is racialized because eviction is so highly racialized. What this map on the right shows is a map of Milwaukee at the census tract level. The blue shading indicates the percentage of Black residents. So you can see it's a highly segregated city where the northern areas are majority Black neighborhoods. And the circles themselves indicate the eviction filing rate. And so what this basically shows is just how dramatically higher eviction rates are in these majority Black areas in Milwaukee compared to the rest of the city. And that's what I mean by the racialization of eviction practices, that eviction is much higher in majority Black areas. And I think for at least three reasons, although of course more, one being these structural economic factors of, I think there are many, well, I'll start with first the history of disinvestment, that these are areas where, owing to federal public policy, as well as, private discrimination and racist housing practices, there are areas where wealth has been sort of sucked out of these areas for over decades and decades. And so it's a situation where they, appreciate more slowly than other areas. And so landlords often have highly extractive management practices where they are investing very little in the properties and quickly moving through tenants. There's also structural economic factors in the sense of, Black tenants and renters still face discrimination among landlords in white areas, and lacking, further options increases the landlord's power in these majority Black areas. And then finally, there's management ideologies where landlords are more likely to discriminate against Black renters and maybe give them fewer concessions when considering whether to evict versus try to work with them. So I think what all these different factors add up to is these strategies in these areas that are highly extractive, where little is being invested in the property and they're using eviction highly readily. And as a result, filing fees disrupt these strategies more prominently than they do in other areas. I'm sorry, I said final point, but this is the real final point, sorry. It's just policy implications. So if we think about returning to the arbitrariness of the eviction filing fees being at their current levels, if we've seen basically that there's a large effect of raising them and there's very little reason for them to stay at the level they currently are, the obvious policy implication is to raise filing fees. This plot on the right shows what the filing rate is on the y-axis, and the x-axis shows the median household income. What this is basically showing is how much eviction rates decrease as household income increases at the tract level. And so if we look at about 30,000 household income, the eviction rate is about 7.5% on average. If we move up to $100,000 as the median household income, the eviction rate is probably closer to about 4 percentage points. So if increasing the median household income by about $70,000 is associated with about a 3.5 percentage point decrease in eviction filing rate, that's not surprising. Richer areas will have lower filing rates. What is surprising is that is the same decrease in filing rate that we would expect from increasing filing fees by about $150. So all this is not supposed to be a clear, precise, or like definitive causal argument, but it's simply showing that the effect from increasing filing fees is similar in scale to the effect of large changes in the economic statuses of tenants. And so one final point is just we should consider, if we raise filing fees, to make sure that we guard against increasing informal evictions that happen through not through the court system. So if we make it harder to evict through the court system, to make sure that landlords aren't just evicting outside the court system. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Henry. And for the audience, I did find my headset, so hopefully you can hear me a little bit better and it's less choppy. But thank you so much, Henry. What a fantastic presentation, and what interesting research and findings. We got some great questions in the chat. So first, Jerry saying thank you for all of your work and noting that every locality needs experts like you to help drive us to better paradigms. Do you in the Eviction Lab have audience on how to dramatically grow localized expertise across America? Oh, sorry, advice on how to dramatically grow that expertise that you and your colleagues at Eviction Lab are bringing to the table?
That's a great question. It's not my area necessarily of expertise, but I would just say, I think within academia, there's such a problem of us keeping, research just within academia, and there being very little point to doing that, because obviously we want to have real effects outside. So I think, I think it's webinars like this and things like this is how we're trying to help grow expertise. And all the data on the Eviction Lab is made public. So I think that can, help. Like, so for example, these filing fees at the county level are all publicly available and downloadable from the Eviction Lab website. And so if you want to do analyses to look at other applications of filing fees, it's all available there. But I think it's a great question and one, definitely to think more about. But it's definitely a problem in academia, and I think the way is sort of trying to have more of this public facing things.
Definitely. And one of the really groundbreaking things about Eviction Lab and about Matt Desmond's book, Evicted, of course, is that there hadn't really been a big focus on the research around eviction before that. And so, a lot of the stuff that, Henry and his team are doing at Eviction Lab is really groundbreaking, as far as nobody has really been investing the same kind of time and effort into researching the impact and causes of eviction before that. So a question from CJ O'Hara, do you know how many communities or counties are funding right to counsel efforts? It helps with representation in areas like Chicago, Philadelphia, and others. Basically, is there any kind of a connection between those right to counsel areas and some of the eviction stuff that you were looking at?
That's a great question. I don't have a definitive list right now. I know there's been some great research in by some legal scholars, basically arguing that first that there is a clear right to counsel embedded in the sort of precedent in the Constitution, but also just arguing or showing that there is this groundswell of support for it. So I don't have on hand right now a list of those, but I have some articles I could send if people are interested that talked about that in greater detail. In terms of how it relates to this research, I was surprised that I think a lot of the efforts around things like right to counsel, around things like, reducing the extent to which landlords can file over for reasons not related to non-payment or not related to cause, sort of these typical issues, the really important ones that tenant advocates have had. I've noticed sort of the extent of renter protections is not highly correlated with the actual filing fee, which I think just points to sort of that point I was making earlier of the arbitrariness, that I think this hasn't been a focus of tenant advocates, and it's sort of been within this domain of just civil court fees. And so I think the areas that have right to counsel are not necessarily the areas that have high filing fees.
Interesting. Thanks, Henry. And one resource that I will plug, and I'm about to drop it in the chat, but I was typing and I can't type and talk at the same time. But the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel has a lot of really good resources on local right to counsel laws. They're tracking, state and local implementation of those laws as well. Sorry. Okay. Boop, dropped it in the chat. So some additional questions from folks. Oh, one thing that really stood out to me and one question that popped up in the chat was about the connection between cost of living and some of the findings that you discovered in this research. One thing that really stood out to me too was how the map that you presented around, eviction filing fees nationally really just visually seem to coincide with some of the research that NLIHC has been doing on our annual report Out of Reach, which looks at the cost of housing and the housing wage and how expensive housing is in different communities. And so I dropped a link to that. Yeah, exactly. I dropped a link to our Out of Reach infographic in the chat, just so folks can look at it too. But yeah, is there anything that your research says about cost of living and how that might also impact some of the prevalency of eviction filings and eviction filing rates?
I mean, definitely, it would definitely affects eviction filings, but I don't think, or at least as far as I've noticed, living hasn't been strongly correlated with the fee itself. But I mean, obviously, certainly in areas with high and rising cost of living, are definitely areas where then renters get more heavily squeezed and evictions are higher. But in terms of specifically about filing fees, I didn't notice. So I looked at things like the household income and property values, which I think are often correlated with. Well, yeah, I didn't look directly at cost of living, so that would be an interesting one. Yeah, I'm not totally sure. My guess would be it's not strongly correlated, but that'd be something to look into for sure.
Yeah, feel free to reach out to our research team. I'm sure would be happy to share information on some of the stuff that we found in Out of Reach that might be interesting to look at.
Oh, thank you.
All right. And so one more question before we let you run off. And thank you, of course, again for joining. But there is a question here from Nathan Reeder about how kind of emergency rental assistance and its availability also plays into the findings about eviction rates and the cost of eviction filing fees.
Yeah, so I think that sort of relates to, that first slide I had about obviously this, there have been these studies, obviously these things like emergency assistance and other economic interventions have been so effective and important in stemming evictions. I didn't notice any correlation again between sort of the filing fee level and the extent of those types of programs. But I was using a fairly crude indicator of those. I was using you know, a very, very good, well put together indicator from Megan Hatch's research that looks at, but it just looks at a wide range of policies, including sort of these I think these emergency rental assistance ones. So that's all just to say that I think the areas with more emergency rental assistance are not necessarily areas that have higher filing fees. But of course, these emergency rental assistance are so important and and essential. But yeah, I've just been so surprised at how little these filing fees have really correlated with the extent of other rental protections.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Very interesting finding. And I lied, one more question. Will the eviction lab start tracking every state? That has also been, that's been my question forever. I love the work Eviction Lab does. And, the dream is to have it everywhere.
With the eviction tracking system.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to ask someone else. I think it's a fairly labor and resource intensive to set those up, but it's a somewhat what's the word, fragmented organization. So I have nothing to do with the tracking system. But I think they're constantly trying to expand the coverage, but I think it's just a question of the amount of resources that they have to dedicate to it, is my sense.
Very, very understandable and relatable conundrum. Thank you so much for joining, Henry, and thank you for all of the excellent work you and your colleagues have been doing. We will look forward to having you back on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Take care. All right, and we will give it just a minute to switch back to our slide deck. So if folks could bear with us. Perfect. Thank you so much, May. Next, it is my pleasure to welcome Siobhan Kelly, who is Associate Director of the Office of Multifamily Analytics and Policy at the Federal Housing Finance Agency, to the call. Siobhan is a repeat guest on this call. She joined back in May in order to talk about the upcoming opportunity to weigh in on the FHFA's request for information on tenant protections. And now she is back to give a friendly reminder about the RFI. So Siobhan, welcome.
Great, thanks, Kim. Thanks, everybody. Again, my name is Siobhan Kelly, and I am the Associate Director for the Office of Multifamily Analytics and Policy at the Federal Housing Finance Agency. So yeah, just here to kind of do a final push. I know I was here in May to talk about our RFI, request for information on multifamily tenant protections, which after the last presentation, I think is very timely. And so here to really just do a final push for comments. To date, we've actually received a little bit over 1,400 comments, many of which are from tenants. The comment period is going to close on July 31st, which is 2 weeks from today. And in order to submit comments, just a quick reminder, there's instructions within the RFI, but you can also just go to FHFA's website, which I know we've got here at the bottom, fhfa.gov, select a topic under, you'll see kind of a menu there, and it would be tenant protections. You can also submit comments the old-fashioned way by sending them via mail to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, Office of Multifamily Analytics and Policy. We're located at 400 7th Street Southwest, 9th floor in Washington, D.C., and the zip code is 20219. We've been reading through the comments and learning so much from people's lived experiences. In addition to sharing a problem that you are facing, please remember to include tangible recommendations on how to address specific tenant concerns. We really want to hear from everybody on what actions FHFA can take to help tenants. So thank you in advance if you've already sent in a comment letter. And if you haven't, we look forward to hearing from you soon. And thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for having me back. Like I said, just as a final push, a reminder, because obviously this is such an important issue and we want to work together to get a solution. So thank you, Kim.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining, Siobhan. And I will next turn it over to my colleague Kayla, who is going to be talking about NLIHC's opportunity to engage on this RFI and to join on to our broader comment letter. Kayla, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Kim, and thank you so much, Siobhan, for providing that overview. Again, my name is Kayla Laywell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a policy analyst here at NLIHC. So as you just heard, the FHFA released their request for input on May 30th, and in the past 6 weeks, we have seen great responses from tenants, tenant leaders, and advocates. This request for input is a top priority for NLIHC, as the announcement represents a major opportunity in our HoUSed campaign's policy agenda, strengthening federal renter protections to address the power imbalance between landlords and renters. NLIHC, along with our partner organizations like People's Action, are calling for robust responses to the RFI from tenants, tenant advocates, and directly impacted people. Again, we have until July 31st, just over, well, exactly 2 weeks today, to weigh in with FHFA to demand and help shape strong renter protections. The Urban Institute estimates that more than 12 million renters live in properties with federally backed mortgages. So any renter protections created by FHFA could cover a significant share of renters across the country and put the country on a pathway towards stronger protections for all renters. Landlords and business interests will, and they already started to, come out in full force to try and stop FHFA from protecting renters. So it's critical that advocates take action and make their voices heard. Before we get into the ways that you can do so, I just want to highlight NLIHC's top 4 priorities for these federal renter protections. First, source of income protections to prohibit landlords from discriminating against households with receiving housing assistance. Source of income protections would also give families greater choice about where to live. Secondly, just cause eviction standards and the right to renew leases to help protect renters from housing instability. Our third priority is anti-rent gouging protections to stop landlords from dramatically raising rents. And fourth, requirements to ensure that housing is safe, decent, accessible, and healthy for renters and their families. We're also urging that FHFA ensure that these efforts are informed by people with lived expertise throughout the process, that they advance racial and social equity, include strong enforcement, and that any federal renter protections are mandatory for all landlords and all properties within FHFA's portfolio. So how to engage? NLIHC has drafted a sample comment letter that you can use to submit your comment, again, by July 31st. I'll be dropping that comment in the chat. So obviously, first is submitting your own public comment. We've already seen great responses from NLIHC's members, partners. We want to urge as many pro-tenant protection comments as possible. Second, we have an organizational sign-on letter, a national support letter, which calls on FHFA to create strong federal renter protections. Specifically, those are the 4 protections I listed out just a minute ago. And I will put that comment in the chat as well. And then finally, we have a renter protections working group that we have 2 more meetings of Wednesday, July 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern time, and then again on Wednesday, July 26th. The purpose of these meetings over the next couple weeks will be to help us review and strengthen NLIHC's longer comment letter that we'll be submitting to FHFA. And I will put that information for the working group in the chat. And finally, if you've done all 3 of those things, you've submitted your own comment, you've signed our organizational support letter, and you've joined our working groups, we're really calling on you to invite your community to participate. Share this information with your networks and encourage them to also demand federal renter protections. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kayla, for joining. What a wonderful overview. Thank you for providing all of those resources in the chat. We have a few questions basically about how folks can make sure that they get a copy of all of these resources. And just so folks know, we will be emailing out resources from today's call, as well as a recording and slides and a summary in our weekly connection, our weekly publication called The Connection. We always run a recap of today's call. So you will be able to find it there. But Kayla, a question for you. Are tax credit properties considered federally funded for the purpose of the FHFA RFI?
Yeah, so they are federally funded. You know, LIHTC is funded by the Department of Treasury, but for this purpose, no, LIHTC is not within FHFA's portfolio. Specifically, we're looking for properties that are have secondary mortgages from Freddie Mae, Fannie. Yep, Siobhan can correct me, but Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Federal Home Loan Banks. There we go. Lots of letters.
Nice. And we have a question too. What does the plan after the comment period look like? Do you know, or Siobhan, if you're still on, is there any chance you would be able to provide some insights?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I had mentioned we've already got about 1,400 comment letters that have come in. So I think from our perspective, we want to make sure that we're reading every single one. We're digesting all of the information. We've obviously been working also closely with the White House on this. So I think, you know, in terms of next steps, once the comment period has closed, we're going to be potentially also reaching out to other stakeholders. I think we're obviously getting a lot of things in writing, but we've also talked about the potential for whether it's a workshop or a listening session, but to kind of have people come into a more public forum, also talk about some ideas to kind of continue this conversation and, you know, really help inform what the ultimate decision ends up being.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Very, very helpful. It looks like those are our only questions. Thank you both so much for joining. This has been a fantastic little update on an ongoing, very, very vital subject. So we will look forward to providing folks with more updates after that RFI comment period ends, which is, I believe, Kayla, when is it again?
July 31st.
Awesome. Thank you, Kayla. Fantastic. So thank you both so much for joining. We are going to keep it moving right along into our field updates, I believe is what is next. So first up, we have Bach Pham and Sloan Wilson from the South Carolina Appleseed Legal Justice Center. So Bach and Sloan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining.
Hey, hello. I hope everyone is having a good Monday and can hear me. My name is Bach Pham, and I'm the Digital Strategy and Communications Manager at South Carolina Appleseed Legal Justice Center. We are a nonprofit based out of Columbia, South Carolina, and we work on a number of issues, including education, hunger, criminal justice, and healthcare. We're grateful to be here today and have a chance to share a bit of our work in the housing space. To start, I'd like to introduce our housing justice organizer, Sloan Wilson, who will be talking about the on-the-ground work she's been doing this year.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sloan Wilson. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the housing justice organizer at South Carolina Appleseed. So currently our housing team is working on expanding housing court to guarantee legal representation for folks served with evictions in Richland County, which is where Columbia, South Carolina is. So in our organizing space, we are working on both educating folks and story collection. So particularly with the education piece, a lot of folks don't know about eviction filings and their impacts on trying to maintain housing after an eviction is filed. So South Carolina currently does not have a mechanism for eviction expungement or record sealing. And we also, shout out to Eviction Lab, have some of the lowest eviction filing fees in the country at about $30. So this kind of creates the perfect storm for landlords to easily file evictions against tenants, often repeatedly, and then these filings stick to tenants' records, even if they settled their case or are found in favor by the magistrate court. And then the tenant might be subsequently denied housing by future landlords. So I particularly work on hosting and participating in community resource events, especially with social workers in our Richland 1 and 2 school districts, to work with families and community members to pass out as much information about this process as possible and hopefully get information out there before someone gets an eviction filed against them and try and get that process a little bit more out there so folks know, and the legal resources that they might need. So at the same time that we're disseminating that information, we're also doing an eviction storytelling project to further demonstrate how eviction filings are impacting folks in real time. This is one thing, obviously, to say what this process looks like. It's another one to hear about, you know, all of these experiences that folks have with having eviction filings and really trying to do everything they can, and it's still not enough. So we compensate individuals who are interested in sitting down for an interview to talk about their eviction filing and to share their story. And then we work with them to get referrals to either social workers, legal services, or SNAP, anything like that that they might be going through. We work individually with those tenants to hopefully get them the aid and stuff that they need in the meantime. So these stories now are, as we're growing this program, it's still relatively new, but they've become kind of the heart of our advocacy around housing court, because they emphasize the experience of thousands of South Carolinians who just are trying to maintain safe, affordable, quality housing in a landscape that is often stacked against them. So that's a little bit about what we're working on the organizing end.
Thanks so much, Sloan. So Sloan gave some great insight into the incredible work she and our housing justice attorney, Emily Blackshire, has done. I'll be talking a little bit about how we approach the digital communications work that we do at a state federal level. To frame it, I wanted to bring something up that was at a housing discussion event we attended and participated in the spring. When asked about what affordable housing means, Michelle Mapp, an incredible law fellow at ACLU of South Carolina, said very simply that definitions matter. Defining affordable housing per HUD and why, from a county standpoint, that it's a big deal. That really stood out to me and highlights a big part of how we do advocacy. In our digital work, our communication work with community members, conversations with reporters, we work to really focus down on education and making sure that building knowledge of housing terminology and understanding of the issues brick by brick. We do believe that there is a bit of a knowledge gap in regards to housing in the community. And one of the goals of our work long-term is to really make sure everyone has better understanding of housing issues. When you see housing stories from us, posts from us, we really try to emphasize bite-sized, relatable pieces of information that we hope over time adds up so that we can talk about legislation to support things we'd like to advocate for in the house space, so that our followers have already a large portion of the way there when we speak with them. This year, as Sloan was talking about, our biggest addition was incorporating this approach with stories from the field. Sloan has done an absolutely amazing job meeting with South Carolinians, sharing their stories, which we've used to connect our housing education material with. We feel it's been a really good way to blend experiences with that educational component and build on the work we started and also start connecting the dots between other areas of the work, including healthcare, sharing stories not just about the health housing experience, but with healthcare as well. We plan to continue all of our work in a big way this late summer and fall by taking much of the communication work we've done in state and moving to work with state partners across the US to do side-by-side comparisons, how two very different states face the same issue. We know there's lots of great groups on the call today, and we're excited to make connections and work on building a national shared voice to discuss housing policies and do something that's a little bit different and outside the box. Finally, we plan to work on a broader campaign on housing this coming winter and spring as presidential candidates launch their campaigns and put a major spotlight in South Carolina, with the first Democrat and third Republican primary being here in South Carolina. So it's not going to be crazy at all, right? So that's just a small sample of the work we do. I want to thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition for their support and giving us a space to talk about work. I always like to leave a conversation with a small action, whether you're on Twitter or Threads. I know controversial these days. We shared a post that says, retweet if you work in the affordable housing space. We'd really love to get to know more of the great individuals and organizations on this call working in space and see if we can connect for future work. You can find us at both locations at Appleseed SE to check out, post, and connect. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for joining today. We have just a quick question about how if someone in South Carolina cannot pay their rent, Where do they go for assistance? Just Nathan pointing out that in Indiana, it's Township, Salvation Army, or Catholic Charities. Does South Carolina have a funded social safety net outside of ERA, or were those ERA funds really helping keep people afloat during and in the wake of the pandemic?
Yeah, so unfortunately it's the latter. We are pretty, I mean, we work particularly in the middle of the state in Richland County. And as far as I know, and I ask every day and call a lot of different resources, we are a little bit out of that by now, but I do know folks that work in mutual aid spaces. So that's something that I've relied on a lot when we don't have the infrastructure really working the way that it should for rental assistance. But yeah.
Very helpful. Thank you, Sloan. All right, not seeing any other questions. Just wanted to say thank you again to Bach and Sloan for joining us today and for all of the important work that you're doing in South Carolina. So next, for our final field update, it is my pleasure to turn it over to, oh gosh, where'd my agenda go? Thank you. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Andrea Davis, who is the Executive Director of HomeWord in Montana. Andrea, thank you so much for joining.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm hoping that you can hear me okay. Great. I also just got a new computer, and I stood my computer table up so I could present, and my camera went flying across the room. So hey, nothing like last minute moves to get you excited about presenting. Thanks so much for everybody, all of your information and all your amazing advocacy. I do have a slide to share, and I'm not sure if May, you're able to charge it up there, but there you go, thank you. So I'm the Executive Director of HomeWord, and HomeWord uses sustainable methods to strengthen Montana communities by teaching homebuyer education and financial skill building and creating safe, healthy homes that people can afford. Next slide, please. HomeWord is we're a nonprofit organization established in 1994, and we're a Montana community housing development organization. So we do two things primarily, maybe three now with policy work. We create and rehabilitate homes that Montanans can afford. We have now built or preserved over 1,300 homes in 14 Montana communities. And we are also a HUD approved housing counseling agency. So we provide renter education as well as home buyer and financial education and counseling. Very specific to, I think, the eviction conversation that we've been having. We were active with the Housing Stability Counseling Program that was funding released by Congress through the NeighborWorks America. We are a NeighborWorks Montana partner, which is a very unique structure in Montana. NeighborWorks Montana is a statewide organization that works as basically the intermediary or the conduit of funding. So the HUD Housing Counseling Grant comes through NeighborWorks Montana, and they partner with organizations like HomeWord to deliver on these services. HomeWord has a very robust financial skill building program, and we took that housing stability counseling program opportunity, and we did a train the trainer where we trained other housing counselors around the state to actually do our financial skill building program. And that was a program that for Montana took a little time to get rolling, but we certainly saw folks be able to stay in their homes as a result. And unfortunately, the funding has wrapped up at the federal level, so that program will be wrapping up as well. But it certainly helped keep people in their homes. Next slide, please. So this is just a smattering of where Montana is. And I think like many states, of course, we've seen such an incredible rise of cost, of home costs, both for mortgages and rents. And I'm sorry that this is old data, but it still really drives home the point here. The challenges that Montanans face, the graphic that you're looking at on your screen is specific to where my office is located. So HomeWord is headquartered in Missoula County, which is the second largest community in the in the state. We're at about 75,000 people in the city proper, about 110,000 within the immediate county surrounding area. And in 1 year ago, actually, it's June of 2022, our median home price was $525,000 in Missoula County, which would require an income of $153,000. But the median home owner income is only $71,000 in our area. So that really shows a discrepancy between what's needed to buy a home, the home sale price, and then really who actually owns homes. So I think it tells a story in and of itself. On the right side, we show rents. Rents for a median 2-bedroom rent at the time was $1,020. Of course, that's generally never including utilities. So the income needed to afford that is $40,000, a little over $40,000, but the mean renter income is only $32,000. And the point of the story here is that there is just a huge gap, of course, between what renters can already afford in our community and then the just stark reality of the ability for renters to have the eventuality to become homeowners themselves. Population growth, much of it driven by in-migration in Montana, has spurred demand for homes and apartments well beyond the supply, if not in all, but most of Montana communities. In March of this year, March of 2023, the typical home value in Montana was valued at $428,000, up from $267,000 beginning, and that was at the beginning of 2020. So we're talking about almost a 40% increase statewide in just the typical home value. And at the beginning of this calendar year, 2023, that home value average median income, average price was $580,000 in Missoula. So we've got a pretty challenging situation statewide, especially in our larger communities. Next slide, please. One of the solutions that HomeWord has been putting forward is the Trinity Apartments project, and we are in partnership with others, including the local housing authority. This is a project that's under construction and also leasing up at the same time. That's the story of our lives as a housing developer and provider, that construction has been a really significant challenge in the last 3 years. But this project is 202 apartments, and it's located on 2 separate parcels in Missoula. There is 72 apartments located on one piece of property that has 2, 3, and 4 bedrooms. First time we've ever built 4 bedrooms, and they're all leased up. The story there is that families often renting 4 bedrooms can't afford those single family homes any longer. So that's why they're turning to apartment living. I would say that that's anecdotally the story there. And then 130 apartments are located on the another piece of property. 30 of those are permanent supportive housing and a harm reduction model. And we're in the process of leasing up all apartment homes now, but those 30 permanent supportive homes will be leased up the last for logistical reasons. We're working with the local coordinated entry system with the city and other service providers on that. In addition, there will be a navigation center on site, and that navigation center is meant to be a service center that is really outward facing for people still living in encampments and on the streets to get connected to behavioral and physical mental health care, and eventually on the path to finding housing stability and job skills and so on. Next slide, please. This is a brief flyer just showing that we're kind of right in the middle of leasing up. You can go ahead and skip past that, please. Gives you an idea of what the rents are there. This is just an article that came out in the paper on Friday. And you know, just this challenge being that we, like many communities, are just not equipped to be handling such intense levels of dramatic rise in homelessness. Now, I say that we had a homelessness camp that was underneath a large bridge in Missoula for some time, and the Department of Transportation in our state closed that down a year ago. So now people, after the emergency shelter closed in April of 2023, there was a boom of urban camping for neighbors who are houseless. Montana is in the 9th district, where there is a Court of Appeals decision that make it so local municipalities cannot basically make it, it's illegal to move people on from homeless encampment in public places if you do not have adequate shelter in your community. And so the city is really struggling with a comprehensive approach for how to handle this situation. Like many places across the country, we are dealing with fentanyl drug overwhelming scenario in our community. So the two, these compounding issues are really intense. These photos are photos from just a park just a little ways down from my office here. I put these quotes in here because the city staff person presented to city council that the two biggest barriers are provider capacity and sustainable funding. One of the most viable options we have are the Trinity apartments that I just showed you. And even that project lacks the long-term sustainable funding needed to provide supportive services in its navigation center. Last slide, please. I know I have gone over my time, but I wanted to give a smattering of some things that were happening at the state level. This year, the state of Montana had a $2.6 billion surplus. Like many states, we did not do, we did some meaningful investments, but we did, we did mostly property tax rebates and reduced our top income tax for our top income earners in the state. The governor did convene a housing task force. I think that was very helpful. It set the stage for a lot of conversation around the root causes of housing unaffordability. And much of the legislation that we saw related to accelerating home construction through streamlining subdivision review and reining in zoning at the local level. But there was some funding. House Bill 819 was $225 million, which is one of the biggest housing bills ever to have passed. I chair the Montana Housing Coalition, and we were very happy to see that get over the finish line. House Bill 5 is part of the larger state budget process. We did fund $5 million to assist with additional homeless shelter capital improvements, which was really encouraging. It's only $5 million, but it's something. House Bill 872 was actually a meaningful contribution to behavioral health. That is providing $300 million for expanding mental health infrastructure and services. Devil's in the details on that one. We have yet to see the details as far as a governor appointed commission for how that money will actually be disseminated amongst communities to help those that are struggling the most. And then lastly, Senate Bill 382 is a wholesale rewrite of our Land Use and Planning Act. And it's meant to reduce NIMBYism, which really makes an explicit effort. This bill makes an explicit effort to shift public participation earlier in the process. So folks basically can't encourage local elected officials to not build that apartment complex in their neighborhood. We shall see. It's all fresh. It's a really big conversation here locally. But one of the things that we're continuing to work on is really holding up the projects like the Trinity Apartments to show the federal investments and how those are leveraged with state and local investments to be able to build such a long-term housing solution. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was wonderful. So a quick question from Nathan. Can you talk about the statewide zoning change meant to build abundant housing in Montana communities with populations of over 40,000, and specifically how eliminating single-family zoning can lead to more affordable housing development?
Thank you for the question. And I'm going to have to do some homework to understand exactly which one Nathan's referring to for the 40,000. There's a few that were released. Senate Bill 245 forces cities of 7,000 in population or more to allow apartment style homes in commercial zones. And then another Senate bill requires cities and towns to adopt rules for allowing accessory dwelling units. And then another Senate Bill 323 makes duplex housing allowable on any home lot in cities with 5,000 in population or more. I will just note that this last one was actually laughed out of the committee hearing in 2021. It was a local Missoula legislator that brought this forward. And it just goes to show you how drastic the housing situation is in Montana. It also, the majority leader brought this forward, and well, that has some political sway, but this actually passed on a bipartisan basis. The Argument being, if we are able to reduce zoning constraints on the way in which there is market opportunity to address more home development, then there will be more naturally occurring affordable homes. It'll be interesting to see. There's naturally pushback from local governments and neighborhood groups. One, neighborhoods are concerned about their neighborhoods changing. And secondly, local government is concerned about the overload on its water and sewer systems. All these things, of course, are closely related. One thing I'll note is that I'm sure Montana's like many states, we don't fund infrastructure for new development. Developers are solely responsible for paying for new infrastructure. That ends up being passed down to new homeowners and renters alike. So it clearly increases the cost of home development. This Senate Bill 819 that passed includes $100 million of infrastructure. If you have spent any time doing housing development, you know that that'll get spent pretty quickly, but it is a move in the right direction. The governor did not want to see it tied to any affordability standards. Fortunately, the legislature thought that that was basically a giveaway to out-of-state developers, and I think they were right. So fortunately, there is a provision to keep that infrastructure money tied to some form of long-term affordability. And that money also requires that there be a 10 dwelling unit per average 10 dwelling units per average if that project is going to access that money. It can be accessed by local government or developers alike. So the idea here is it's been a very interesting pendulum swing in Montana, and I think across the country, where folks have recognized that there is potentially an opportunity through loosening of zoning reform to a large degree that's been really holding back opportunity. And as many of us on this call know, zoning has been a tool that's really been utilized to protect home values and oftentimes been used to segregate people in our community and our communities, and negatively impacting many Americans over time. And so it'll be interesting to see how these initiatives actually help us build more affordable homes. And I'm emphasizing affordable because I'm hopeful they will. I am nervous about that. Montana is a destination state, and it gets a little worrisome to see what might happen from the investment side of things, because those protections did not get passed. What I mean by that is more short-term rental opportunities and things like that.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us and for all of the incredible work that you're doing in Montana. Always a pleasure to hear an update. Yeah, and looking forward to having you back on again. Great. All right. And so for our last 4 minutes, I'm going to be providing a policy update. I think the big news from the last week is the House announcing or releasing, I guess, its draft Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill. So this is the draft bill for funding for FY 2024. I am going to drop our analysis in the chat so folks can feel free to read along as I'm going over some of the high points and I guess low points of the bill. So honestly, it could have been a lot worse. I was preparing for it to be a lot worse. I was ready to see some massive cuts to HUD's programs of up to 25 to 30%. And while the bill does propose some deep cuts and even the elimination of important programs, it also adequately funds most rental assistance programs. According to the House Appropriations Chair, Kay Granger, that should be enough. What they propose should be enough to adequately cover existing voucher contracts. So that essentially is saying that this would be enough to stave off mass evictions from HUD's properties, which were very much in the mix before seeing the bill text. Before I continue, I do want to pause here and just say thank you. Thank you to everyone, each and every one of you on this call who took the time to call, email, or tweet your elected officials to urge them not to enact massive cuts to programs that people rely on in order to maintain safe housing. I truly believe it was thanks to the advocacy of the people on this call and our members, partners, and allies that made the difference and helped stave off those mass evictions by driving home the impact that those cuts would have on families and friends, neighbors, yourselves, your communities. It is so, so important that your members of Congress hear from you. And so I just really wanted to say thank you. Sometimes advocacy can feel like yelling into the void, but sometimes it does work in some ways. So again, thank you so much for all of your work. Overall, HUD ended up getting an increase of about $6.4 billion, or roughly 10% from FY23 enacted levels. This, of course, happened despite the incredibly tight top line that House Republicans had imposed on themselves. For just a quick recap, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden reached an agreement to raise the federal debt ceiling until 2025. And that was in exchange for capping FY24 spending at roughly FY23 levels. House Republicans then caved to demands of the far-right House Freedom Caucus to draft their bills to FY22 levels instead, which would have resulted in cuts to HUD of about 30%, which of course would have been disastrous. While the funding increase is of course welcome, I want to be clear that this is far from a good bill. HUD needs an estimated $13 to $15 billion in order to just maintain the level of services from the previous fiscal year. And again, we got 6.4 out of that 13 to 15 billion needed. And that increase in cost is due, of course, to the rapid increase in the cost of rent, which have in turn pushed up the cost of housing assistance, and because of a shortage of FHA receipts, which typically help offset some of HUD's budget. And HUD's increase comes also at the cost of rescinding $25 billion for IRS funding and really significant cuts to transportation. I believe that the cuts to transportation were around 60%, which is just mind-blowing. And it's also important to keep in mind that this is a manufactured crisis that Republicans created. We didn't have to make any of these choices. We could fund programs at the level needed and to meet the level of demand. And so while I'm of course relieved not to see these massive cuts to rental assistance and to see some increased funding for rental assistance and homelessness assistance, I still feel very much like, why am I thankful for you saving me from a situation that you put me in, right? So very much a mixed bag. I will say that there were some high points. So the good news, of course, is that we saw some increased funding for the cost of vouchers and both the tenant and project-based rental assistance programs. I also see that it is 4, so I will keep it quick. It also provides an increase to HUD's homeless assistance grants program, which is vital for helping connect people experiencing homelessness to the resources and supports that they need to find and maintain stable housing. Programs aiming to address the dire needs of Native communities would also receive some significant funding increases in the bill. But there are some important programs, like I saw folks pointing out in the chat, that would face funding cuts, including public housing, the Public Housing Capital and Operating Fund, Section 811, Housing for Persons with Disabilities, Section 202, Housing for the Elderly. The Home Investment Partnership Program would see the steepest cut without being zeroed out. They would lose funding by about $1 billion down to $500 million in the next fiscal year. There are some programs that were zeroed out completely, including the Family Reunification Program, Incremental Voucher Program, Choice Neighborhoods Initiatives, and Housing Mobility Services. Speaking of NIMBYism, as we just were, they also zeroed out funding for a newly created grant program that would help incentivize local communities to alleviate some of the barriers to affordable housing development through incentivizing them to change local zoning ordinances. And the bill text also contains some problematic provisions that would bar HUD from using any of its funding from implementing, administering, or enforcing its rule about affirmatively furthering fair housing. And we also saw, of course, anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion language that would bar any of that funding from being used to advance big, quote unquote, woke policies. We can be thankful to all of the advocates who have weighed in to make sure that we didn't see those massive cuts and that 2 million people did not lose their housing assistance. So again, thank you so much. Next slide, please, May. Thank you so much. We are waiting for the Senate THUD bill to be released, which should be as soon as today. I will say that we are expecting the Senate bill to be kind of the high watermark. So look forward to that analysis from NLIHC as soon as that bill comes out. But the fight is still far from over. It ain't finished until President Biden signs the FY24 bill. And so we will need to keep up the advocacy to make sure that we maintain those funding increases for rental assistance, for homelessness assistance programs, and we see those vital increases in funding for other important programs that people rely on, including public housing. And of course, we want to see that funding for the Native American community block grant increased as well. So we have on the screen a QR code. Folks can use their phone to take action. You can also use the little link on the screen that will take you to NLIHC's Take Action page, where you can weigh in with your members of Congress, keep on telling them about the importance of these programs. Yeah, and like I said at the offset, thank you all so much for your advocacy. We could not do this work without you. So with all of that being said, it is now 4:03. I will not hold you for a second longer. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We will share out the resources and a recording of today's call in our follow-up email on Friday. Thank you again. Stay safe, everyone. Keep up the good work that you're doing, and we will talk again soon. Bye.